The first thing an American audience must understand when we talk about inflatable Sherman tanks during World War II is that this was not a gimmick. It wasn't a funny trick. It wasn't a cartoon visual gag. Inflatable tanks became a serious operational instrument, developed inside a professional framework, the U.S. Army's deception apparatus, which by 1944 began to mirror the sophistication of British decoy units. The United States approached this not as a comedy act, but as a new battlefield dimension. Manipulate the enemy's perception of mass and direction. The story of fake Shermans only works when we look at the psychological environment of 1944. The Wehrmacht, by that point, was losing mobility, losing fuel, losing the initiative. Germany had to rely more heavily on aerial photography analysis, rail traffic observation, and signals intelligence from the French road networks. German commanders needed to guess where Allied armored mass was accumulating. So if American commanders could make Germans believe Shermans were gathering in Sector A when in reality they weren't, the Germans might reinforce the wrong sector, move reserves to the wrong crossroads, or hesitate at the wrong moment. And hours of hesitation in 1944 could translate into collapsed front lines. To understand why inflatable Shermans became credible, we must also understand the status of the Sherman tank itself. By 1944, the M4 Sherman was not simply a vehicle, it was a visual symbol of American steel industrial power. Sherman silhouettes were burned into the German frontal lobe. They had fought them in North Africa since late 1942. They saw them in Sicily in 1943. They saw them in Normandy in 1944. When German reconnaissance officers studied grainy Allied buildup photos, they were counting shapes. How many dark rectangles? How many turret shadows? How many long gun barrels? A Sherman had a recognizable geometry: hull height around 9 feet, length about 19 feet, turret shape like a compact dome, and road wheel pattern with 3 pairs on each side. This geometry was exactly what the inflatable designers copied in rubberized fabric. The origin of this idea didn't come from Hollywood prop departments. It emerged from deliberate experiments with artificial positions that go back to World War I. The French used fake artillery barrels made of papier-mâché. The British used dummy observation posts to draw sniper fire. The Italians built dummy airfields. But none of these early experiments were as industrially developed as the U.S. Army deception units of 1944. By the late 1930s, inflatable manufacturing already existed commercially for civilian objects: inflatable boats, inflatable rafts, even inflatable parade floats. The materials were there. What the U.S. Army needed was the doctrine, the theory of how to deploy fake armored mass not just as a passive shape, but as part of a combined deception operation. A shape alone does not fool an enemy. A shape plus radio plus sound simulations plus correct positioning relative to road networks, that becomes a weapon. Why would Germany fall for this? Because German intelligence was not omniscient. It is a myth that the Wehrmacht always saw everything. In late 1944, Luftwaffe recon flights over the Western Front were rare because fuel was scarce. Photography was limited to short windows. Examining movement patterns required interpretation, not just observation. So when American deception officers positioned inflatable Shermans near a known Allied logistics road at a plausible distance from an ammunition depot, with jeep tracks arranged to simulate heavy tank movement, German photo analysts could not say with confidence, "These are rubber." They were forced into probability assessment. And in wartime, probability is everything.
British experience influenced this shift. The British had run Operation Bertram in North Africa in 1942, where fake tanks covered by real nets tricked Rommel before El Alamein. American officers studied that case, But the U.S. took it further by industrializing the inflatable production to create an entire fictional armored formation on short notice. This became one of the defining characteristics of what would later be called the Ghost Army, although that name trivializes the scale. The official units included the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops. Inside that structure were visual deception engineers who understood optical angles, lens compression, shadow depth in oblique sunlight, and how reconnaissance cameras in German hands reacted to different angles of approach. This was scientific, not theatrical. The American goal was not, let's prank the Germans. The goal was to introduce doubt. If the Germans turned cautious when spotting masked Shermans, even if those Shermans were made of rubber, that hesitation purchased time. And time is the most strategic asset in an offensive campaign. A real Sherman could move about 25 miles an hour on road, maybe 12 miles an hour cross-country. If the Germans misjudged where these vehicles were gathering, their counterblow could arrive hours too late. In the context of Normandy, where the front was dynamic, an 8-hour delay could shift a breakthrough point by kilometers. Another key factor, the American home industry could supply the materials. Rubberized inflatable walls, pumps, valves, all of this was available because the U.S. already needed such materials for life rafts and transport devices across the Atlantic. And because Americans standardized manufacturing, inflatable Shermans could be produced with consistent dimensions. A German photo interpreter could not argue these look inconsistent, because they weren't. They were dimensionally plausible. In this sense, inflatable tanks are not simply a story of battlefield gimmickry. They are a symbol of the American shift toward information dominance. American war culture had an engineering mindset. If a problem can be solved by industry, solve it. A tank needs armor and a gun, but a fake tank only needs to create a silhouette long enough for the enemy to draw the wrong conclusion. Inflatable Shermans were a way of saying, if the Germans want to count tanks, give them a lot to count. This is the mental frame for Part 1. The story begins before Normandy, before aerial photos, before sound trucks. It begins in the American realization that a fake Sherman could change the calculus of a real German corps commander. In the final sum, these rubber weapons were not jokes. They were strategic chess pieces. To understand how inflatable Shermans worked as operational tools rather than curiosities, we must break down their tactile, mechanical reality. These were not toy balloons on a parade truck. They were shaped from vulcanized, rubberized canvas sheets, with seams stitched and bonded, and internal compartments designed to hold air pressure across broad surface sections. An inflatable Sherman weighed around 60 to 70 pounds when packed. A real steel Sherman weighed around 33 tons. The difference is absurd on paper, but that absurdity is what made them effective. You could literally carry an inflatable Sherman folded across the shoulders of 2 enlisted men, and in less than half an hour convert that folded canvas into a silhouette that at a distance of 200 yards had the mass of a mid-war M4 on photographic film.
The American deception doctrine required pairing visual equipment with behavioral deception. A row of inflatable Shermans simply sitting motionless in a field would not convince a skilled German analyst. The fake tank needed context, the marks of logistics, the echoes of an armored group's lifestyle. Tank battalions leave tracks. Real Shermans crush ruts into soft ground. Real Shermans move in patterns that map onto road networks, fuel supply, and infantry coordination. So in deception operations, engineers and sign crews brought portable tank track simulators, wooden rollers attached to jeeps which could carve the illusion of track prints into dirt roads. You drag these rollers along a lane adjacent to your inflatable tank park, and you produce the geometry of heavy track pressure. The Germans see that geometry in reconnaissance photos and cannot dismiss it lightly. They note, yes, tracks are present, yes, the width matches known Sherman tread spacing, and yes, the pattern suggests heavy weight, not a jeep.
But visual and ground simulation alone were insufficient. In the European theater, German SIGINT units and radio direction finders were not asleep. They were listening. Every American armored division on the Western Front had a radio signature. Call signs, signal rhythm, operational chatter patterns. So the U.S. deception units created full fake radio networks. Operators and the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops transmitted scripted traffic that matched the chatter of a real tank formation. Map grid references, dummy fire control updates, and imaginary fuel requests. They mimicked the tempo of armored operations. German interpreters often cataloged which American units had distinct signaling styles. So U.S. deception units studied real divisions and copied their signaling fingerprints. Every fake tank cluster was paired with fake radio presence. Then came sound. The U.S. Army used large speakers mounted on half-tracks to broadcast recorded tank engine noise. These sound libraries were not random noise. They were professionally recorded audio tapes from real Shermans, played through amplifiers that could project sound across 2,000 to 3,000 yards when conditions allowed. Flat valleys could carry sound. Forest corridors could trap it. In an evening fog, a German patrol listening from a hedgerow might hear what sounded like American armored columns maneuvering. In truth, they were hearing the product of sound engineers. And this is key. Inflatable tanks were not deployed alone. They were the visual element of a broader illusion package. The U.S. applied all three components, visual, radio, acoustic, into a single tactical organism. When these layered elements overlapped, the Germans saw through multiple channels the same story. Massed armor exists here. And if three independent intelligence channels confirm a thesis, analysts have trouble contradicting it. Visual recon might see silhouettes. Radio intercepts might detect battalion-sized traffic. Sound detectors might hear engines. A German analyst could hardly argue all three were illusions, and certainly not when time pressure forced rapid assessments. Let's ground this in specific examples. In Luxembourg in late 1944, during operations designed to confuse German force allocation around the approaches to the Rhineland, U.S. deception battalions erected inflatable Shermans along a sector that had low offensive value. The purpose was to make it seem like American armored grouping was accelerating near a particular crossroads. The German command, already sensitive to American mechanized penetration after the defeat of their armor in Normandy and Falaise, interpreted the visual cluster as a pre-attack staging area. The Germans, facing the enormous strategic stress of post-Ardennes depletion, repositioned a mobile reserve platoon to counter what they believed was an armored exploitation threat. That reserve was wasted in the wrong location. That is exactly the kind of time shift that inflatable Shermans were meant to induce.
Another example, before Operation Viersen in March 1945, deception brigades created phantom armor to suggest a crossing zone along the Rhine, further north than the real crossing point. They erected inflatable tanks, inflated them at dawn, placed them along simulated assembly areas, dragged track rollers, and broadcast engine rumble. German reconnaissance pilots, flying in small windows due to fuel scarcity, photographed these dummy positions. Analysts marked them on their intelligence maps. Germany's intelligence system was brittle. It could not effectively distinguish between a rubber Sherman and a steel Sherman across a river valley. So the Germans committed artillery observation assets against sectors that did not matter. The real armor crossed elsewhere. The inflatable Shermans were not abstractions. They were operational levers. The logistics of deployment were surprisingly lightweight. A truck convoy could transport dozens of dummy tanks. Each inflatable Sherman, when deflated, could be folded into a compact shape no larger than a duffel bag. To inflate them, crews used gasoline-powered compressors. It took less than 20 minutes to raise one tank into full silhouette height. And when it was time to move the deception, crews could deflate,
fold, load, and retreat in under an hour. This mobility meant deception units could generate phantom armored divisions in multiple locations in short bursts. The Germans could not anchor their calculations. The American army essentially possessed the ability to create the illusion of mass on demand. And mass, or the appearance of mass, is firepower. From a psychological standpoint, the inflatable Sherman is a material demonstration of how information can become a weapon. American soldiers learned not to define success solely by how many tanks were physically present, but by how many tanks the enemy believed were present. The distinction here is crucial. If the enemy reacts to a number that doesn't exist, the non-existent number becomes strategically effective. And that is the deeper engineering of this story. The U.S. military did not ask, "How many Shermans do we have?" They asked, "How many Shermans do the Germans think we have?" Inflatable tanks expanded that number dramatically. The results of inflatable Sherman deception cannot be measured the same way we measure tank-on-tank kill statistics. There is no neat accounting book that says, "This rubber Sherman caused this panzer to fire here." Psychological warfare does not create clean arithmetic. Instead, we measure effect by analyzing German misallocation of resources, delayed reactions to Allied maneuvers, and post-war testimonies that confirm Allied illusions influenced German operational thinking. When American inflatable Shermans appeared inside the European battlespace, they did so as parts of deception campaigns where hours mattered. The modern viewer must think not in terms of cartoon trickery, but in terms of OTA loops: observe, orient, decide, act. The Germans' orientation phase was distorted by phantom mass. That distortion multiplied in significance because the Wehrmacht, by 1944, was in a condition of deteriorating mobility. They were running short of gasoline, reserve formations, and time. So every time they invested fuel into a counter-movement toward a phantom tank cluster, that fuel was not available elsewhere. Every withdrawal of a reserve unit to defend a false axis of advance was a real expenditure of opportunity. Inflatable Sherman deceptions, therefore, weaponized German scarcity.
Let us consider a hypothetical tactical timeline based on typical field records. German reconnaissance flight photographs a sector at 0730 hours. The photo team processes and interprets the imagery by mid-afternoon. They see what appeared to be 100 Shermans. They signal to the relevant corps-level intelligence desk. At 1800 hours, German command believes that an armored buildup exists at one sector. They cannot verify by sight again for another day because fuel allows limited recon flights. Meanwhile, an American corps commander executes his real operational concentration 30 miles away. By the time the Germans understand the real axis, it is too late to reposition mechanized units because their tracked vehicles depend on rationed fuel deliveries. The German chain of command cannot react dynamically. The inflatable Sherman cluster, therefore, did not need to hold the illusion for days. Even 12 hours of deception could be enough to waste a German opportunity. War is not only about who kills more tanks, it is about who wastes the opponent's time. One of the most important consequences of the U.S. deception program was that it forced German analysts into a conservative mindset. If you're unsure if a group of tanks is real or fake, the risk of ignoring it is high. So the Germans sometimes acted as if questionable tank masses were real. This is the psychological inversion. Even when they suspected some kind of trick, they could not ignore it. Because if they ignored the wrong cluster, and that cluster turned out to be real, they would suffer catastrophic consequences. So the German system gradually developed hesitation, a mental uncertainty. And hesitation is fatal in offensive warfare. This effect scaled into full operational relevance during the last phase of the war, when the U.S. and British armies crossed into Germany. Multiple deception deployments used inflatable armor as stage props for phantom brigades. After the war, German senior leaders who were interrogated in Allied intelligence facilities described their experiences of late-war misestimations. They acknowledged that Allied armor seemed to appear in unpredictable densities, making it impossible to forecast where a breakthrough would occur.
Some German officers genuinely believed American industrial output was so gigantic that the Americans simply had unlimited tanks. They were counting fake Sherman silhouettes as real ones. In that sense, the inflatable Sherman contributed to a mythology, the myth that America had infinite armor. The truth is that American output was massive, but finite. The illusion of extra armor created a mental inflation of American capacity. Germany lost psychological orientation. They no longer knew when to commit reserves. By March 1945, the German strategic decision-making loop was broken beyond repair. Now it is crucial to look at one more dimension: Allied internal benefit. Inflatable tanks freed up real Shermans by masking their absence. If 40 real tanks were missing from Sector A while preparing to perform a breakthrough in Sector B, inflatable Shermans in Sector A could shield that relocation. American armor could move more freely because their absence was concealed. German intelligence would not see a thinning line and would not reinforce correctly. So inflatable Shermans generated negative space. The Germans could not see where armor wasn't. Deception created stealth in reverse. Instead of hiding tanks, they hid the absence of tanks. Why does this matter now? Because this is a demonstration of information logistics. The inflatable Sherman story is not just about World War II hardware. It is about the tension between material power and perceptual power. The Allies possessed tanks, but they also possessed the ability to manipulate the enemy's perceived distribution of those tanks. Inflatable Shermans weaponized the photograph. They weaponized the reconnaissance report. They weaponized the German commander's anxiety. Modern psychological warfare concepts, from drone decoys to radar spoofing, share the same DNA. The basic idea remains unchanged. If you force the enemy to commit energy to the wrong locations, you have already defeated them at the planning level. The inflatable Sherman story is therefore not a nostalgic anecdote. It is an early case study of cognitive manipulation as a battlefield instrument. So when we summarize this history, we must not trivialize it by treating it as a wartime prank. The inflatable Sherman was a hard strategy tool that exploited the German dependence on reconnaissance probability. It turned the American industrial environment into an instrument of disinformation, and it succeeded because of timing, logistics, and psychology, three forces that define modern conflict. And when we speak about this to an American audience, it is important to underline that this episode reflects the American capacity not just to produce machines, but to produce illusions that alter the enemy's decision timeline. That is the deeper strategic legacy. This is where the inflatable Sherman leaves its lasting imprint on military history. It demonstrates that the battlefield can be bent not only with stronger armor and bigger guns, but with well-engineered falsehoods. In that silent war of interpretation, the war inside the enemy's mind, those rubber tanks were decisive. Story number 2. The story of metallic foil as an electronic weapon begins at the meeting point of physics and practical necessity. Radar is fundamentally a radio echo system. A transmitter sends a pulse at a particular radio frequency. That pulse travels to a target. Some energy reflects off the target, and a receiver measures the time delay and strength of the return to estimate distance and size. The strength of that return depends on the radar cross-section of the reflecting object. In other words, how effectively the object scatters radio energy back to the radar. The crucial technical insight behind metallic foil is that you can create very large, dense radar echoes using intentionally engineered tiny reflectors, and you can do it cheaply and in huge numbers. A dipole antenna, the simplest, most basic resonant radio element, is essentially two short conductive rods aligned along a line. When radio energy at the right frequency strikes a dipole about half a wavelength long, currents are induced and the dipole re-radiates strongly. If you have millions of such dipoles, each tuned to the radar's operating frequency, you create a cloud of reflectors that appears on enemy radar as dozens, hundreds, or even thousands of targets where there are none. Practically, this is done with strips of metal foil or later metallic-coated paper cut to lengths approximating 1/2 of the radar wavelength being targeted.
To give the listener a concrete way to think about the math, radar wavelength lambda relates to frequency f by the simple wave relation lambda is equal to c over f, where c is the speed of light, about 300,000 kilometers per second. If an operator wants to target a radar operating at 3 gigahertz, a 10-centimeter wavelength, the dipole length that resonates strongly is about lambda over 2, roughly 5 centimeters. If the radar works at a lower frequency with a meter-scale wavelength, the required strips are proportionally longer. That relationship, half-wavelength tuning, is the reason the first chaff implementations involved carefully cut strips rather than random shavings. Length matters. Inventors on both sides of the Atlantic and in neutral labs recognized the idea independently during the early 1940s. The British codenamed their development Window. The concept was elegant in its simplicity. Bundle millions of short metallic strips, release them from an aircraft, let them disperse into a cloud that drifts with wind and forms an electrically reflective curtain on the radar screen. The radar then sees the curtain as a massive formation, obscuring real aircraft behind or within it, or producing spurious, false targets that mislead plotting officers and fighter controllers. In the laboratory, this was straightforward. In the operational environment, it demanded engineering of materials, deployment techniques, and understanding of how radio systems actually processed echoes. Materials selection and manufacture were practical engineering problems with operational consequences. Early experiments used aluminum foil and metallized paper because they were lightweight, inexpensive, and conductive enough to reflect radio waves. The strips had to be light enough to float and disperse, but heavy enough not to cling together and short out into clumps that behave like a single large object. Packaging was also non-trivial. Aircraft needed containers or dispensers that could eject many strips quickly and reliably at the right altitude, while maintaining crew safety and not interfering with bomb loads or fuel. The British solved this with simple cardboard canisters and timed releases. American and later Soviet systems developed variant dispensing methods tuned to their aircraft and mission profiles. Beyond the basic physics, two further technical aspects determined effectiveness: dispersion dynamics and spectral tuning. Dispersion dynamics describe how the cloud behaves after release, how the strips spread horizontally and vertically under wind and turbulence. A compact, dense cloud produces a brighter, more concentrated radar echo in a small sector of azimuth and range. A thinly spread cloud gives broader but weaker interference. Mission planners had to choose how much chaff to release and at what altitude to achieve the tactical objective: concealment for a small formation or a deception envelope to mask a major raid. That choice involved calculating aircraft speed, expected wind shear, and the time window during which the chaff would remain usefully dense. Spectral tuning is the other critical factor. Radar systems in use at the time spanned a range of frequencies, from long-wave early warning types to shorter-wave, fire control, and centimetric types developed later in the war. A chaff cloud cut to resonate at one frequency would be much less effective against a radar operating at a very different frequency. Early implementations therefore chose strips sized to interfere with the most important German systems, those used for ground-controlled interception and early warning. Later operational thinking recognized that frequency agility and mixed-length bundles increased the chance of effective interference across multiple radar bands. In other words, rather than a single length, mixed-length chaff packages could spoil several radar bands at once. The invention of metallic foil had additional conceptual cousins in radio countermeasures: jamming, broadcasting noise or false signals at a radar frequency, and chaff, both aimed to deny reliable information to the defender, but they function differently and have different operational strengths. Jamming is active and requires transmitters with power and precise tuning.
It can be localized and dynamic, but is often detectable and limited by available transmitter power. Chaff is passive once released, cheap in resources, difficult to trace to an originator, and capable of physically masking entire air corridors without needing electronic power on board the target aircraft. In many missions, the two techniques were combined: chaff to create general confusion and concealment, jamming to overwhelm critical nodes or to shape the radar operator's response. Because metallic foil exploits a physical resonance effect, its effectiveness is immediate once a radar pulse interacts with the cloud. A radar operator sees sudden bright clutter, multiple returns, and sometimes the illusion of a coherent formation. That is what made chaff such an operationally disruptive tool. It created not just noise, but believable, deceptive patterns. Experience from early experimentation showed that radar plotting officers, trained to interpret echoes into tracks and vector fighter responses, could be led into making fatal mistakes, diverting interceptors to chase ghost formation, or failing to detect an actual penetration masked within the false echoes. This psychological dimension, that a measure of trust in radar plots could itself be weaponized, is as important as the physics. When chaff moved from laboratory demos into the sky, its impact was assessed in gritty operational terms. Could it lower losses, confuse enemy controllers, or create exploitable windows for attacks? The technique proved versatile. Commanders used it as a blunt concealment tool, a surgical deception device, and an enabling partner to electronic jamming. This section breaks the operational story into 3 threads: landmark uses and campaign scale effects, tactical employment and techniques, and observed, measured effects on German radar, plotting, and fighter interception. Drawing on after-action logic, engineering constraints, and contemporary reporting to show how metallic foil changed the air war. 1. Landmark uses and campaign-scale effects. The first operational uses of metallic foil were deliberately experimental and tightly controlled, designed to test assumptions under live-fire conditions. Early combat sorties that deployed chaff in quantity demonstrated a consistent pattern. Enemy radar screens filled with clutter. Plotting officers hesitated or misidentified returns, and fighter controllers found their vectoring information less reliable. Once that pattern was clear, commanders scaled up. At the campaign level, large bomber offensives used chaff to permit concentrated penetrations into defended airspace. In several notable raids where chaff was employed en masse, the defender's situational picture was degraded sufficiently that ground-controlled interception and anti-aircraft artillery coordination both suffered. For planners, the metric was simple. If chaff reduced the number of successful fighter interceptions or decreased bombing losses per sortie, it paid for itself in saved aircraft, crews, and increased mission effectiveness.
Chaff's effect was not strictly proportional to amount. A relatively modest mass of strips, if released in the right place and at the right altitude, could create a radar curtain whose apparent size far exceeded the physical mass of foil. That meant a single well-timed chaff deployment covering the approach corridor to a target could mask dozens or even hundreds of bombers as they passed through a defended zone. Conversely, indiscriminate or poorly timed release could disperse strips too widely, creating background clutter but not masking a formation during the critical window. Thus, early doctrine emphasized disciplined release profiles tied to precise approach geometry. 2. Tactical employment and techniques. Tactically, crews and planners developed a set of repeatable techniques that maximized chaff effectiveness. These techniques were practical responses to the physics described earlier: half-wavelength tuning, dispersion, and to the operational realities of enemy radar networks. A. Corridor masking. One common tactic was to create a chaff screen along the approach corridor to a target at a predefined range and bearing. Aircraft carried chaff canisters arranged in timed sequences, first a thin curtain to confuse long-range warning radars, then denser releases as the formation approached zones where ground-controlled interception was likely. The intent: create a false front that radar operators would track, while the real force slipped through at a slightly different bearing. Corridor masking favored coordination. Navigational discipline among the attacking force had to be high to exploit the transient concealment. B. Window for penetration. Another use was to produce short-duration windows of low visibility on radar, right at the point where aircraft crossed defended boundaries. Here the timing was critical. Strips were released to create dense clutter for the minutes corresponding to the formation's transit of a defender's most dangerous engagement zone. This technique required careful calculation of aircraft airspeed, altitude, and meteorological drift. When executed well, it could convert a defended intercept corridor into a momentary blind spot. C. Distributed deception. Mixed-length bundles that produced echoes in multiple radar bands allowed attackers to confuse multiband networks. If defenders had both early warning radars, longer wavelength, and centimetric fire control radars, shorter wavelength, attackers could release mixed-length chaff so that both classes of systems returned spurious echoes. This forced defenders to reconcile inconsistent plots, a classic cognitive overload problem, reducing the speed and quality of decisions. D. Combination with jamming and electronic attack. Chaff rarely acted alone. In many planned raids, window was paired with active jamming from dedicated electronic warfare aircraft or bomber-borne jammers. Chaff created broad-scale spatial confusion. Jamming added spectral noise on particular frequencies. Together, they produced both spatial and spectral uncertainty, making it difficult for plotting officers to filter real targets from false ones. Jamming also served to draw attention to specific radar nodes, which chaff could then obscure more effectively.
E. Tactical masking for special missions. Beyond mass raids, chaff enabled specialized tactical operations such as low-level attacks, reconnaissance penetrations, or diversionary feints. A small group of aircraft could lay a deceptive cloud that mimicked the radar signature of a larger force, drawing fighters away from the true axis of advance. In other cases, reconnaissance aircraft used thin chaff strips to hide egress routes after photographic passes. 3. Measured effects on German radar and air defense. How did these tactics translate into measurable operational outcomes? The answer lies in a mixture of qualitative observations and quantitative reports from both sides that, when triangulated, show clear impacts on detection, plotting confidence, and interception results. A. Radar operator confusion and plotting uncertainty. The immediate effect was psychological and procedural. German radar operators and plotters, who relied heavily on relative echo strengths and continuity of tracks, found their screens populated with inconsistent and rapidly changing returns. False tracks fragmented plotting boards and introduced ambiguous vectors. Instead of a clear track that could be handed to a fighter controller, plotting centers saw clouds and ghost formations that demanded verification. That verification either consumed time, critical minutes, or forced controllers to rely on visual or fighter-sighted confirmation, both of which were slower and less reliable than trusting radar plots. B. Delays and misdirection in fighter control. Ground-controlled interception depended on rapid, accurate vectoring. Chaff-induced clutter increased the time between initial radar contact and actionable intercept orders. In some engagements, controllers vectored fighters toward strong but false echoes. By the time they recognized the deception, the real bomber stream had moved out of effective interception range. This tactical misdirection reduced interception density over the actual targets and often skewed German fighter effort toward empty airspace. C. Degradation of range and accuracy. At technical levels, chaff reduced effective radar range for genuine targets within or behind the cloud. Echo strength from a bomber at a given distance fell relative to the much denser return from the chaff, effectively reducing detection range or causing misestimation of altitude and distance. Where fire control radars attempted to lock through a chaff cloud, the presence of many competing echoes could prevent stable tracking.
disrupting anti-aircraft batteries' ability to establish accurate fire solutions. D. Quantitative mission outcomes. Operational reports from attackers and post-war analyses indicate tangible mission-level improvements when chaff was employed correctly. Loss rates for bombers in missions employing well-executed chaff deployments generally fell compared with similar raids without chaff, and successful strikes on designated targets increased as planners learned to integrate window into attack profiles. Exact percentages varied by campaign, meteorological conditions, and enemy adaptations, but the pattern was consistent. Chaff reduced the effectiveness of German radar-based defense systems enough to alter engagement outcomes noticeably. E. Enemy adaptation and countermeasures. Not all uses of chaff produced decisive strategic change. Over time, German defenders adapted with procedural and technical measures, improved filtering of transient returns, cross-correlation between independent radar stations, and the use of visual confirmation and optical observation to supplement radar. These countermeasures reduce chaff's bluntest effects, but rarely eliminate them entirely. Moreover, adaptations often required time to implement and could be outpaced by attackers' tactics, like introducing mixed-length bundles or varied release profiles.
4. Notable examples and illustrative vignettes. To illustrate, imagine a night raid where a 300-aircraft force approaches a heavily defended city. At 40 to 60 kilometers from the target, designated squadrons release chaff to form a deceptive screen aligned 5 to 10 kilometers offset from the true approach lane. German long-range radars pick up a large, dense echo and feed that to plotting centers. Controllers, trusting the continuity of that track, vector night fighters toward the phantom. As the real formation passes behind the false screen, short-wavelength fire control radars, unable to lock through the clutter, fail to cue anti-aircraft batteries in time. The attackers penetrate deeper, drop ordnance on the primary target, and exit while defenders pursue the ghost. That vignette is not theory. It is the distilled form of multiple real missions where chaff-generated mismatches between perceived and actual tracks produced exploitable windows. Another example. In a mixed Anglo-American operation, bomber wings coordinated timed chaff releases with dedicated jamming runs. Jammers suppressed specific radar nodes, while chaff produced broad spatial confusion. German defenders, overwhelmed by the combined spectral and spatial disruption, lost the coherent common operating picture they needed to mass effective responses. Chief among the consequences was the inability to concentrate fighters at decisive points, which diluted their interception effectiveness across the theater. 5. Limits and environmental sensitivity. Chaff effectiveness depended on atmospheric conditions. Strong crosswinds could stretch and dilute a cloud rapidly. Inversion layers affected vertical dispersion. Precipitation could weigh down strips and reduce scatter. Similarly, radar networks that featured rapid frequency diversity or well-dispersed redundant nodes mitigated chaff's impact. Thus, chaff was powerful but conditioned, a highly effective tool when used intelligently within its operational envelope, not a universal panacea. In sum, the operational history of metallic foil shows a tool that changed tactical calculus. It created confusion on the enemy's screens, reduced the reliability of automated plotting, and forced defenders to expend time and resources on validation rather than immediate action. When combined with diligent planning, disciplined release techniques, and complementary jamming, chaff could tip the balance in favor of attackers by creating windows of exploitable uncertainty. The introduction of metallic foil into aerial warfare did not occur in a vacuum. Defenders, confronted with a new and disruptive phenomenon on their radar screens, adapted rapidly both technically and procedurally. That adaptation, and the broader consequences it created, tells a story of an arms race in the electromagnetic domain. In this final section, we examine three linked threads. 1. the immediate German countermeasures and operational changes that reduced chaff's bluntest effects. 2. The longer-term strategic and doctrinal consequences for air defense, intelligence, and offensive planning. And 3. The legacy of chaff in post-war military thought and Cold War electronic warfare. Each thread demonstrates that chaff was not simply a one-time trick, but a catalyst for systemic change. Immediate German countermeasures, technical fixes, and procedural shifts. When a defender encounters a novel form of interference, the first responses are practical. Identify what the cloud looks like on different systems, find cross-checks that reveal the deception, and modify procedures to avoid wasting assets on phantoms. German ground-controlled interception and air defense networks did precisely that. One class of countermeasures was procedural. Plotting centers and fighter controllers tightened rules of engagement for radar contacts. Instead of immediately vectoring fighters toward any strong echo, controllers began to require corroboration from multiple sources before committing significant resources. That corroboration could come from another radar station that did not show the same echo, from visual observation posts, searchlight sighting, or from infrared optical detection when available. The main effect was to slow decision cycles, a painful trade-off because air defense systems depended on speed, but it reduced the number of fighters diverted to worthless targets. In operational terms, the defenders accepted reduced reaction tempo in exchange for higher quality engagement. Another set of countermeasures involved data fusion and cross-correlation. Radar networks that simply forwarded raw echoes to local plotters were vulnerable. Networks that compared returns from geographically separated stations could identify transient anomalies. If one site showed a dense cloud while adjacent sites did not, controllers could infer a local deception. This demanded better communication and coordination between radar nodes and plot centers, which in turn required organizational changes and improved discipline in information sharing. The result was that chaff worked best where the attacker could mask multiple radars simultaneously or exploit gaps in networked coverage. Where defenders had overlapping radar coverage and rapid interstation reporting, the chaff's advantage narrowed. Technical countermeasures were also pursued. Filters and simple signal processing techniques could reduce the visibility of short-lived spikes and transient echoes on certain displays. For fire control radars that needed to lock onto a single target for gun laying or missile guidance, engineers worked on algorithms and operator techniques to stabilize locks against short, fluctuating clutter. In addition, the use of height-finding radars and optical height measurements helped distinguish between a cloud of lightweight strips and a formation of heavy aircraft occupying specific altitudes. Where these tools were available and used effectively, the ability of chaff to obscure precise altitude and bearing decreased. Frequency management was another technical response. Chaff is most effective when its physical dimensions match the radar's wavelength, so defenders moved toward diversification, employing a layered approach that included radars operating at different bands so that a single chaff cloud could not easily blind every sensor. This is not an instant fix. It requires hardware and deployment changes, but it forced attackers to adapt by mixing strip lengths and dispersal profiles, creating a back and forth in technique and counter-technique. Long-term strategic effects. Beyond the immediate battlefield, chaff prompted rethinking about how nations structured air defense and how offensive planners used deception as part of operational art. 3 strategic effects stand out. The normalization of electronic deception as a valid instrument of war, the expansion of investment in both electronic countermeasures (ECM) and electronic counter-countermeasures (ECCM), and the evolution of intelligence priorities. First, the normalization of deception. Before chaff, many commanders treated electronic measures as niche or experimental. The visible operational successes of metallic foil turned deception into a mainstream adjunct to kinetic planning. Planners recognized that controlling what the enemy believes is often as important as controlling geography. That recognition had long-term doctrinal consequences. Electronic deception became part of pre-attack planning cycles, something to be synchronized with navigation, timing, and strike bundles, rather than an optional add-on. Second, the arms race in ECM and ECCM. Chaff is an inexpensive passive ECM. Defenses that invested in ECCM, better filters, diversified frequencies, redundant sensors, and integrated command network, forced attackers to invest more in sophisticated techniques and coordination. Post-war military budgets increasingly carved out funding for dedicated electronic warfare units, research into adaptive jamming and frequency hopping, and improved signal processing. The dynamic was straightforward. Each advance on one side created incentives and requirements for advancement on the other, a pattern that proliferated into the Cold War, where electromagnetic dominance became a central pillar of military power. Third, intelligence and counterintelligence priorities shifted. Detecting the manufacturing, stockpiling, and potential deployment of chaff materials became an intelligence interest. Equally, deception itself could be used to mask larger maneuvers, not only in air operations, but in naval and land operations alike. Analysts learned to value multi-source verification. Radar alone could no longer be trusted uncritically. So imagery intelligence, human reports, and direction finding of radio emissions grew in importance. In short, chaff drove a more integrated intelligence posture. 3. Legacy. From WW2 to the Cold War and modern doctrine. The tactical concept behind chaff, using simple physical resonant scatterers to create false returns, found descendants across the post-war era. During the Cold War, both superpowers developed chaff and more sophisticated decoys as standard equipment for aircraft, ships, and even missile systems. Naval vessels, for example, adopted chaff to confuse surface-to-air missiles and anti-ship missiles. Aircraft carried chaff cartridges to defeat radar-guided threats. The principle remained the same: generate a more attractive echo for the hostile radar than the real target. Technological evolution also broadened the toolkit. Where analog radars once dominated, digital signal processing and phased array systems created new opportunities for ECCM. Adaptive filters, Doppler discrimination to separate moving aircraft from drifting strips, and pulse compression techniques that improved resolution. Attackers responded with mixed material chaff, radar-absorbing decoys, and active deception transmitters that could mimic motion or Doppler signatures. The dialogue between detection and deception moved from crude clutter to subtle shaping of the electromagnetic environment. Doctrinally, chaff reinforced a lesson that persists in modern militaries. Control and manipulation of the information domain is a legitimate and often decisive instrument of power. Air commanders learned that synchronized, multidimensional operations that combine kinetic strikes with electronic measures produce disproportionate effects. That lesson appears across modern manuals and exercises. Electronic warfare units are embedded in strike packages. Cyber and electromagnetic operations are planned in concert with fires and maneuver. 4. Limits to legacy and ethical consideration. Despite its broad influence, chaff also has limits that shaped its legacy. Environmental dependency, weather, wind, and dispersion dynamics mean that chaff is never perfectly reliable. It is a probabilistic enabler, not a guarantee. Defenders with robust, redundant networks can blunt chaff's effectiveness. The technique's value is highest in contexts where the attacker can concentrate spoofs against a critical node or exploit gaps in coverage. Finally, there are ethical and legal dimensions. Chaff is non-lethal and intended to deceive sensors rather than harm people directly. Nonetheless, deception that enables strikes on populated areas raises moral questions about proportionality, civilian risk, and responsibility. Post-war discourse occasionally reflected on whether deception that reduces the chance of interception increases the severity of attacks and thus civilian harm. Those debates did not eliminate chaff as a tool, but they complicated its unreflective adoption. and contributed to careful operational planning that weighs downstream effects.